Welcome to Criminalization 101 for Information Workers. My name is Mariame Kaba. I use she, her pronouns. I'm zooming in from Lenape land in New York City. I'm the founder and director of Project Thea and also co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization. And for tonight, I'm also a co-founder of and a steering group member For the People Leftist Library Project. I'm going to let my comrades, Megan and Bean, say more about FTP a little bit later, but I welcome you on behalf of all three groups this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I just want to invite, sorry, let me pull this up here. I just want to invite all of us to take a deep breath and to settle in. Just take a deep breath with me. These are hard times we're living in and through, and we are so grateful that you would take time today to spend a couple of hours with us. I'm going to drop in the chat a digital self-care toolkit, and I'm just inviting you to please use it as you need tonight as we get through this time that we have together. I think sometimes in dark times, it just matters for us to be present with each other. So we'll just do that today. I would like to begin, as we always do, with a digital land acknowledgement adapted from Adrienne Wong. And I'm going to put that land acknowledgement in the chat also for folks to follow along. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology. Within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet, not available in many indigenous communities. The technologies that are central to almost everything we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join in acknowledging all this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in repair, restitution, decolonization, and co-strugglership. So this session today is part of our ongoing series titled Building Your Abolitionist Toolbox. Our goal in the series is always to explore different resources that help us build daily practices to move us closer to a world free of imprisonment, policing, and surveillance. Together, we are learning how we can use abolitionist organizing tools and values in our relationships, our homes, our schools, our organizations, and our communities. We are considering how we can deepen discussions about justice, harm, and healing, and we are diving into active ways that we can work towards an abolitionist future that includes everyone. For those who are interested, you can find the resources for all of our previous Abolitionist Toolbox series sessions at our Abolitionist Tools website, which I'm putting in the chat. I also want to say that I know sometimes when you come into space, you are like, oh my God, there's so many things happening in the chat, or I can't get all the resources. You don't have to worry. We actually have all the resources in a separate Google Doc, which we'll share with everybody today. So you'll have all the resources that we're putting into the chat in that document. So no worries about that. We have an incredible team with us today because everything worthwhile is done with others. Aaron of IC is holding down tech today. You could chat them if you have any issues at all in terms of tech. We have ASL interpretation and live closed captioning. You can access the live captioning by clicking on CC at the bottom of your screen, or if you have those 3 dots, you can also access it that way. I don't know today. Erin, do we have Laura with us today, or is Laura going to do our notes later?
I think Laura's going to do them later.
Okay. So Laura Chow-Reeve is of Radical Roadmaps, is our regular graphic note taker, and always like to share that you can find more about Laura and Laura's work at her website, which I will put in the chat as well. So we'll have graphic notes after this as well. We're also recording this because a lot of people let us know that they couldn't make it in person and really wanted the information. So we'll decide after this is over whether we can post this whole thing onto the site or not, or an edited piece of it, but it's being recorded as well. Regarding the chat, you are able to use the chat. And if you have questions or comments, we invite you to drop them into the chat. And we'll have a few minutes at the end to take some of your questions, hopefully, time permitting. Our next session in the series is happening on November 30th, same time, 6:30 to 8:30. And we'll be featuring a new zine that's focused on young people, youth, and helping them think about abolitionist de-escalation, particularly verbal de-escalation. So come back to that or send young people our way. There'll be more information about that soon on our website. So let's get centered in our values for this event. As we always do, I'm going to share some words that I appreciate and are adapted from Free Minds, Free People. We believe that at the center of liberation is radical love for each other and for ourselves. That love pushes us to try to create a better world. Because of that, we are working to minimize the amount of harm that occurs in our spaces. White supremacy, misogyny, ableism, classism, homophobia, and transphobia exist everywhere, even in radical spaces. They are some of the threads out of which normative society is woven, and it is hard to untangle them. So if you're called out today, particularly in the chat, in some way, for perpetuating any of these, please understand that it is not because you are unimportant or that we wish to exclude you. Instead, we're trying to demonstrate compassion and care and do the least amount of harm toward people in our communities, particularly those with marginalized identities. We recognize that we are all entrenched in these systems of oppression and that we all have work to do. We invite everyone to be accountable for their participation within these systems of oppression. We ask everyone to challenge themselves and to fight against it in these spaces. If you enact displays of power and oppression, we will talk to you. We will invite you to educate yourself and relearn how to interact with others in the space without enacting harm. If you cannot or are unwilling to address it, we will ask you to leave. We need both love and rage in every part of our lives to carry on dismantling oppression. Both can be a part of radical resistance to the destructive world in which we live today. If we put in the effort to truly learn from and care for each other, we seek to forge stronger bonds and to create a community that we can rely on rather than systems of violence. So being accountable to each other for our behavior is a really good way to start. Please join me in welcoming Megan Riley and Bean Yogi, who are co-facilitators of this session. Megan and Bean, I'm going to throw it over to you to introduce yourselves. Maybe I'll just start with Megan, since you're going to go first.
Great, thanks, MK. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan. I use she or they pronouns. I am currently living in Pomo territory, in Mendocino County, which is Ukiah, California. And I am a doctoral student at UCLA, in their School of Information Studies. I also did my master's in library science there. My areas of focus are, labor issues in libraries and archives, as well as the intersection of public libraries and the carceral state. And I am very happy to be here, and I will pass it over to Bean now.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. My name is Bean. I use they and them pronouns, and here I am on Duwamish territory, otherwise known as Seattle, Washington. I'm stoked to be here as part of For the People, the organization that Mariame and Megan are part of, and also as a public library worker, as well as a union steward, a proud union steward. Thanks for being here today. I'm excited to dive in with y'all. I think maybe we have some slides to start off. Yeah.
You're on, Megan.
Great. Since this is Criminalization 101 for information workers.
Go back to the first slide, please, Aaron. Thank you. Because Megan's going to get everybody involved first.
Yes. So I figured we would all start on the same page, and go over some basics like what is criminalization. And I invite you to drop in the chat what criminalization means to you, what you think of when you think of criminalization. And yeah, just share your thoughts on what your definition of criminalization would be. Thank you, Mariame. I can also go ahead and start going through.
Folks will put,
if folks want to. Oh, great. Okay, people are starting.
Folks will put in the chat, and then you can just read off what they say.
All right. So I says criminalization is a series of processes that make certain people, behaviors, or actions worthy of punishment and control. Julie adds the process by which something becomes seen as criminal. Those are great definitions. And they don't have to be like complete definitions. I just love to hear, and it can be either specific to libraries or in general. Grace says a method for controlling and enforcing behavior through coercion and the threat of the loss of freedom and civil liberties / rights. Katie says, I'm thinking about how much I've heard people say problem patron this week. Yeah. That's a big one. Carol says application of punitive measures. Juliana says using the law to make people a problem. That's great. Succinct. Sarah says, I think of power and norms as determined by systems of power. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, these are all great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Great. People can keep adding as we go. Oh, Meg says the process that makes difference illegal, dangerous, and punishable. Yeah, that's a great one.
I also noticed earlier Lawrence's response.
Oh yes, I missed Lawrence. Sorry, Lawrence.
Projection of settler fears onto Indigenous peoples and those who are othered.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Lawrence. Sorry, I missed you.
Here.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm making hash, 2 eggs.
Perfect. Thank you.
Let's see. Jay says it relies on the racialized figure of the criminal. Absolutely. Stephanie says, when I think of criminalization, I think of punishment and power over others who deviate from the norm. Absolutely. Social norms play a huge part in criminalization, both inside libraries and in general society. Wonderful. Great. Should we? Oh, still more. Awesome. Thank you. Carol says, I also think of carceral logic and its proliferation within institutions like libraries. Definitely. Yeah, the carceral logics at play within not just public libraries, but academic libraries, special collections, things like that can be really overwhelming. Annie says a focus on protecting property, not people. That's a really, really great addition. And I think that's one that is particularly salient in public libraries, especially when we're talking about the criminalization of poverty. Oscar says, I think also how criminalization is selective is significant, definitely. If you can afford to pay a fine for doing or not doing something, then it's basically permissible for you to do it. Absolutely. Or if you can afford great lawyers, or if you are even just, white presenting in a lot of cases, that is kind of a get out of jail free card. Oh, yeah, Bean, great point. Late fine for overdue materials at the library. Really, really excellent point, which thankfully a lot of library systems are moving away from, but still far too many that use monetary fines to punish. Kate says, +1 everything above, and I think of criminalization as a process that works to disappear people and behaviors from public life. Absolutely. The carceral solution to social problems is just to displace it. Yeah. Oh, and I mentioned the replacement fees instead of, or in addition to late fines, which absolutely works the same way. These are really great, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts on this. Great. And I think also to Kate's point, I think a lot about how libraries are often the site of contact between people and the criminal justice system or the carceral state, whether that's unhoused people or teenagers, or people, experiencing like a mental illness episode, things like that. Oftentimes the library, particularly public libraries, are the place where they first or again come in contact with the carceral state.
Do you want to move to your slide?
Yeah, so let's move ahead to the slides. And people can feel free to keep, dropping things in the chat as we go if things occur to you. But just to kind of, again, get on the same page of where we're starting from when we talk about criminalization. And I should mention also that these slides are going to be available later, so don't feel like you have to write anything down or anything like that. So criminalization is a political process, that goes beyond the passage and enforcement of criminal laws. And as we've, discussed earlier, it extends to the categorization and treatment of specific types and groups of people as inherently criminal, and therefore unworthy of human dignity, resources, and protection from violence. So criminalization is what is fueling the violence of policing and prisons, and detention and deportations, and of family separation. So whether that's at the border, at the prison gate, in our schools, and by the family policing system. And of course, also libraries, which is what we're here to talk about today. Criminalization is a process of sense-making and place-making that makes the existence and the violence of policing and punishment seem both necessary and inevitable. It's also a process that demands that we devote an ever-growing share of our collective resources to surveillance, policing, punishment, and exile, and renders them our default response to every form of harm, conflict, and need. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess that was the, oh, never mind, sorry. I didn't need to go to the next slide. I also just wanted to say a little bit more about that. So criminalization is the mechanism that animates and operationalizes the interlocking systems of oppression at play in the lives of marginalized people in particular, but not exclusively. And it is what impedes progress on every front of our struggles for liberation, racial, gender, sexual, reproductive, migrant, disability justice, educational, economic, and environmental justice. And we cannot get to futures free of violence of all kinds without confronting and challenging criminalization through ideology, laws, policies, practices, and what Black feminists call controlling narratives, which are stories that shape how we see, understand, and act in relation to each other. And I believe we have a few resources to drop in the chat as well. Wonderful, thank you, Mariame. Yes, so this has been adapted from Andrea Ritchie and Beth Ritchie, who I believe are unrelated. They're writing on the crisis of criminalization. All right. And so we can go on to the next slide now. So this is a little tiny, but again, we'll have these images available later. These are a web of institutions and identities that drive criminalization. And so we see on around the middle, we have the institutions, and so the institutions are in red, identities in black. And we see a lot of different things, gentrification, healthcare providers, child welfare, parole. Interestingly, libraries are not on here, but I think that that's something that often goes unnoticed, and that's why we're all here to talk about it. We also have identities like formerly incarcerated, genders outside of the social norm, homelessness, your youth, or your age rather, survivors of violence, low income, other identities like that. And all of these form a web of criminalization in which we can be caught. And we can go to the next slide now. And we have another fun little graphic. The tentacles of criminalization, laws, policies, narratives, and ideologies. So of course, swimming in this sea of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, capitalism, colonialism, that's all around us, misogyny, gender oppression. We have this octopus of criminalization, and its different legs or tentacles, I guess, rather, that make up narratives and policies of criminalization. So we have, you know, beliefs about homeless people, beliefs that, you know, Black people commit more crimes, or that Black mothers are bad mothers, or that let's see, what else we have the school to prison pipeline, drug laws, the war on drugs as well, sex work, and all of these again are arms of criminalization within our society. And I think I'm going to wrap it up around there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to add into the chat. Otherwise, I think we can, if anyone else, you know, MK or Bean, if you have anything you want to add, feel free. Otherwise, we can move along.
I just wanted to appreciate the people and the artists and the thinkers that can put some of these types of visual
Absolutely.
graphics together, because I think we all learn in very different ways, and being able to visualize and sort of relate to some of these concepts, which are really big and on a system and a cultural level, can just be helpful for, at least for me, to be able
Absolutely.
to conceptualize them from different angles. So shout out to the artists and to
Yeah.
the folks who help us make sense of all of this.
Yeah, great point, Bean. I think that having different methods of conceptualizing these ideas is really important in terms of being inclusive of neurodivergent people, of people of younger ages often find graphics can be more helpful. And yeah, again, thank you so much to the artists and the thinkers that help with this, help us make sense of this.
One of the ways that we wanted to talk about criminalization for library workers was to get into the idea and the ways that we operate when it comes to the maintenance of safety in free public spaces. I'm sure that many of us who work in libraries and archives know exactly what I'm talking about, but I think it's worth diving into and trying to make sense of together when we're talking about criminalization. With this graphic of the octopus in front of us, I just wanted to really name that libraries are among some of the last public spaces where people can just be, just exist, without having to purchase something, without having to, you know, earn the right to be there by having money. And that, I think, is what we tell ourselves, those of us who work in libraries. But then what actually happens in libraries, which I know happens in my library every day, is that library patrons are criminalized for all of the things that they're criminalized for in our larger society outside of our buildings, for being unhoused, for using drugs, for being disabled or neuroatypical, for being Black, trans, etc. I could name them all, but I'm sure we know. So one of the things that we wanted to dive into today and talk about today is the reality that if criminalization is not just the mechanisms of incarcerating people and punishing people, but it's also the ways that we create culture around the idea that policing and punishment are, like Megan said, inevitable, necessary, normal, then when we turn our attention to libraries and the ways that we normalize criminalization all the time in the name of public safety, of staff safety, um, we don't want the concept of safety to be weaponized in that way to justify and normalize criminalization. Hopefully not. And I also just wanted to name that within the history of libraries, especially in this country, the practice and the coordinated effort to exclude, punish, and marginalize, certain people is really at the foundation and at the heart of the history of libraries, despite what we might think of them as being spaces that are free for all. Not the not the case. I think many of us know or sense. So, one of the, if we can go to the next slide, one of the questions that we have for you, with all of this in mind. Oh, pardon me.
No,
Actually,
go back. Yeah. 'cause
pardon.
you
Sorry.
dropped
I thought.
it. It's okay.
I'll actually just drop it into the chat, because we do have a question for y'all today around the maintenance of safety in free public spaces. What are some of the examples that you have observed in the libraries and the archival spaces that you work in? Feel free to drop that into the chat. I see that Kate is naming the over-reliance on contracted security to keep library spaces safe in quotation marks, calling the police as part of staff safety plans, like the safety plans that staff are, I'm assuming, trained to enact. Tracy is talking about how so many surveillance cameras exist in libraries. They sure do. Libraries that are supposed to be spaces where we protect privacy. Yes. Nikki mentions treating compliance and safety as equivalent. Thank you for naming that. One of the ways that we tend to define safety is by people adhering to the many rules that libraries create for them. And so if you're deviating from those rules, then I think the assumption is that inherently you are unsafe, or you are jeopardizing the safety of the space, when we know that's often not the case, right? We know that there are plenty of rules that are established in libraries that are more about control than safety. The chat is poppin'. Zoom makes it hard to scroll through the chat when people are commenting, which is, please keep commenting. I see that Sasha in Chicago was talking about those strict behavioral rules and expectations. Kevin mentions security, following folks into the bathrooms. Yes. Our very own Megan mentioned a collection of unnecessary or extraneous information from patrons about their use of materials. Yeah, I really appreciate all of these ways that we either as library workers or as library administrators notice that criminalization is taking in place, and maybe are trained to enact these things, are told that if we don't do these patrols or walkarounds that Lawrence mentioned in the chat, then we're not doing our jobs. We are, yeah. Great. So feel free to keep commenting, keep sharing, because I hope that as much as we can, take a look at what people are sharing in here. And if you have questions about that, or if you are confused about how some of these examples amount to criminalization in library spaces, then, we should talk about it. But some of the examples that I just wanted to name that I'm sure are in the chat as well are the ways that we, assume that it's our best and only option to call the police when there's an altercation, when we surveil patrons and kind of speculate on their level of intoxication because we have a rule that says that you're not allowed to be intoxicated in the library. When you file a trespass order on a patron so that if they enter the library space again, they could be subject to immediate arrest. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but there's an organization out in Minnesota called the Library Patrons Union. And those folks have done an analysis on trespass orders in library spaces that's really illuminating. So what we wanted to do, and which you got a little preview of in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the slides in the presentation, we wanted to share a case study with you about an incident that took place in Baltimore at the Baltimore County Public Library. And thank you, MK, for dropping a link into the chat about the incident. Essentially, what happened was that library staff called the police on a teenager who had been previously kicked out of the library and banned for violating one of the rules. And when the young person returned to the library, staff called the police. Police came and they beat him up, like in full view of all the other patrons that were there that day. It was caught on video. A patron who saw what was happening wanted to document it to try to prevent it from happening again. And you'll see in the article, if you click on it, that there's going to be an investigation, and the library plans to cooperate with the police in their investigation. But investigation or not, right? Like that investigation does nothing to heal the harm that was done to that young person, and does nothing for other patrons who witnessed that and now have the message loud and clear to them that if they fall out of line with library rules, that something like this could happen to them, particularly if they are somebody who is criminalized in our larger society. Because I think it's important to point out that this likely would not have happened to somebody with a lot of systemic power who there may have been other options that occurred to library workers about how to handle that situation. But when criminalization is the normalizing of punitive, carceral types of measures, it's something that the wheels are greased for us to do things like this. So if we can go to the next slide now, thank you. The questions that we want to reflect on today, we're not trying to answer every single one of them in the chat, but we are inviting you to really sit with this incident, to know that this isn't the first time it's happened. And, the person who this happened to, the young person, is not a statistic. We want us to really sit with this and ask ourselves, in a case like this, what if you know, imagine that you are a library worker in an incident like this, you know, what does support look like to respond to a situation like this in a way that challenges criminalization, that doesn't simply reenact it? What barriers do you foresee in your own system for intervening if an incident like this were to take place and you were there? What would be in your way to try to stop it from happening? We're also here to think and talk about creative workarounds and solutions for situations like this. I think many of us who've worked in libraries know that sometimes we ask patrons to leave and not come back for a little while because, you know, for any number of reasons. And so when this does happen, when patrons do return, despite a boundary that we state or a request that we make, the only solution is not just to call the cops on them. So what are those creative workarounds? And then finally, like MK said earlier, everything that is worth doing together, worth doing with others, worth doing in coordination. So very likely, us as individuals are not going to be able to stop criminalization in our library systems single-handedly. So we ask you to reflect on what resources and people are presently available to you, not only inside of your system, inside of your organization, but also in your larger community, also virtually. What are the spaces that you can tap into so that you can reflect on these questions and your own practice as a library worker? I'm seeing in the chat that Tracy wanted to offer that we shouldn't be banning children from libraries in the first place. And I think that is a really excellent point. And you could think of it as a creative workaround and solution to the problems that we're talking about. Like if we did not ban children in the first place, then them returning to the library would not be a problem that we had to solve. So thank you, Tracy, for bringing that up. I see Megan also added that the Library Patrons Union, that organization out in Minnesota, is a great example of empowering patrons to learn and implement de-escalation techniques that they can use themselves. So it isn't just library workers that have a responsibility to interrupt criminalization and to, you know, practice some of this more life-giving responses that we want to see. But yeah, it's something that we can all participate in, whether we are library workers or not. Thank you, Oscar, for naming that there is the Creative Interventions Toolkit. And that toolkit exists. It provides a model of harm reduction and dispute resolution that tries to get away from criminalization and interactions with the criminal justice system. And Oscar's also asking if there's a possibility for developing some sort of training program for library workers and other community members that's based on Creative Interventions Toolkit. Very interesting idea. Who's on it? Yeah, more comments coming in. I think Ari is answering this question about creative workarounds and solutions. And they mentioned revisiting the ban and see if it's possible to provide services with new communication. I think that's a great idea. I. Miller adds, I think it goes back to the situation where the trespass was put into place. When we enforce that policy, do we include in it alternatives for folks to go if we truly believe they need a break from the library as a space. I really appreciate that.
So I think I just want to jump in also here to say that I think some of the points that are made speak to the importance of having a plan before all this goes down. I just think that oftentimes we rely very heavily, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, on policy when we don't have strong relationships and we don't have the skills. And we defer then to, well, it's in the book here in this way, in this strict language, right? But when you build your confidence in terms of your skills and you have strong relationships, then all of a sudden the policies become no longer a box, but rather potentially a guide. And I think that this is part of where we are in institution land, is that because those institutions where there's been such a breakdown in trust, and honestly, capitalism has done such a good job at de-skilling every single one of us, that we often live in fear of having to actually do anything when shit goes down. Like, because everybody's like, I need a 40-hour training to know how to diffuse this situation. No, you don't, actually. You diffuse situations all the time. You do it amongst friends. You do it at unexpected moments in time when you're not even thinking about it. You learn how to de-escalate by just like following to see how things are going. And then you just follow that person's body language, like by instinct, and you're able to get them to calm down. You de-escalate your children all the time. Like, we have these skills. I think it's gotten to a point where we think everything needs to be an expertise level of intervention, when in fact, most things can be stopped at the most basic level without going like escalating it times 10. But our fear of each other, our lack of confidence in ourselves, the fact that we believe that every single thing ought to be outsourced to someone else. It's someone else's expertise, someone else's problem. I want a number to call so I don't have to do anything. That's a late capitalism invention. Because there were years and centuries and times, you all know this, in neighborhoods not that long ago where you grew up, where nobody called anybody and shit got fixed. Okay. Or grandma down the street was the one handling the business. And we didn't have all these other kind of 10 layers of things that we need to be able to do. And we weren't afraid of liability. And it wasn't all about like, so I think there's something here about our inability to actually just lean in to the fact that people are people. And it isn't true that everybody's actually going to take a gun out and shoot. I know we're living in a saturated environment where that's like the message we get is we ought to be afraid, and we ought to be afraid all the time. And I really do like to remind people that these kind of extreme forms of violence that we are peppered with sporadically through mass media and social media and all that is actually exceedingly rare. Most people are going to actually respond to you if you talk to them as a person. And I think we have a lot of layers to get through in order to be able to pierce this sense of a need to like constantly be finding the exact right thing to say at the exact right moment, and being afraid of, quote, failure, when in fact we ought to lean into that, because when you're failing, you're trying. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I do think there's like this sense of we're feeling it, I can see, like, when I talk to people, like there's just this sense of fear and worry, and I don't know, and I'm not sure, and what am I doing, and I need, and I think training is helpful, but it's really usually a crutch, because it doesn't actually tell you what to do in the real time. In real time, you defer right away to the things you've practiced over and over and over again. You don't defer to the one training you got 1979 and then remember it at that time. No, if you've practiced and you're doing it all the time, it's going to come back to you, and you're going to, all of a sudden, it's going to be rote to you, right? And because we don't want to practice, then of course we're worried. Of course we don't know what to say. Of course we turn to the cops, because that's so easy. 911 is really easy to remember. And that's why, the opposite of that, when people try to do community-based solutions to addressing harm, which is actually the vast majority of ways that harm gets resolved in our culture, it's just also the unfunded way that it happens, right? But I think people end up in a position where they're like, oh, you know? But in fact, that's what you do every day. You do it all the time anyway. I think it's time for us to kind of reclaim that in our spaces. So I just wanted to throw that in too, Bean. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I get that sense when we start talking about these things that people are very like kind of like holding your breath the whole time. It's okay to exhale. We do know what to do. We just have to actually practice doing it over and over and over again.
No, thanks, MK. You said that so beautifully, and I think about how that piece I typed into the chat, that when you're what you said, that when you're failing, you're trying. I think that we live in a culture right now, and it's something that we reenact on the left all the time, that, you know, if you fuck up, then you're out. You know, and that's just I think we have to practice something else around that too. I also, as you were talking, something that came up for me is how I think that there are literally moments in the library where I've held my breath when I've confronted somebody, you know, being violent in the space, or, you know, people getting into fights in the space, that, you know, and trying to interrupt that, because maybe we're short staffed that day and I literally don't have anyone behind me who is my colleague who I trust. And it is sort of like, I really have this sense in my body, like, oh no, I'm entering into this on my own. And I think that's a reality for a lot of library workers right now. So there is this question for me of how our working conditions, our labor conditions, are a part of this question of like, what does support look like in this case? And the reason why I bring that up is because in my system, and I know in other systems, there are times where, as a bargaining point, or as a union talking point, we bring up the realities and the fears around staff safety. And the question is, do we weaponize that to fight for more criminalization, more power and control enacted in our spaces? Or do we use that to say, if library workers had the support that they needed to respond, you know, holistically, intentionally, to the crises that do take place in library spaces, then that's when we are actually addressing this idea of safety in free public spaces. When that idea of safety includes everybody and isn't just like, oh, the people that are worthy of protection, or the people who we just assume are the victims, and the people that we assume are the perpetrators. So that's just fresh in my mind right now because of what's happening in my own system. But I just wanted to bring that up. Let's see, I'm just returning to the chat. And I see that there's a lot of stuff that folks are bringing up. Maggie said, I think people are also afraid of how they might be held accountable for how they intervene in situations when they feel unsure. Like that might be made a scapegoat by administration. And there's a lot of responses to that. I think a lot of people resonating, and that's another thing when it comes to working conditions and labor, when we have really strong structures and infrastructures of support, so that when you do what you do every day, which is, you know, for other situations, like MK was saying, it's like we actually react and respond with nuance, clarity, intention outside of the parameters of our established policies and procedures all the time. We make exceptions. We understand that as library workers, it's like we literally don't have to uphold a fucked up policy. And many of us know what it's like to to actually just not do that. Yeah, when I was looking at these questions and thinking to myself how I would answer them, I mean, one of the things that provides me a ton of support is by doing my best to find who among my colleagues are people that share some of my values. That doesn't always refer to the people who use the same language that I do or who identify as abolitionists. But I've surprised myself by how often I have found folks inside of my library system who, when I first met them, I assumed that they maybe were not critical of criminalization or didn't think about it that much. And I think people think about it a lot, actually, and are just waiting for an invitation to talk about it and to try something else out. So yeah, just wanted to say that. And then Miller also pointed out that our patrons' conditions are also our working conditions, which I think a lot of people resonate with. Let's see. Yeah, thanks to everyone who is contributing to the chat. I can see a lot of really rich conversations happening in there. So much so that every time I start to read one of them, Zoom scrolls me up and I can't finish reading it. Let's see. I see Kendra brought up. Keeps moving. Oh, we can combat the antagonism created between patrons and staff by the institutions. The patrons become the enemy when the issue is that we are understaffed and resourced. Yeah, Nikki has responded and pointed out that adequate staffing is one very simple way to avoid calling cops, to avoid feeling like you have to. And Megan agreed and said that so much of library safety training treats worker-patron relationships as inherently antagonistic. Thanks for naming that. Yeah, and then Grace also added that it is really hard to work through things. I think what I got out of that, because then the chat moved, is that it's really hard to work through things when you have a ratio of like 58 patrons to 2 staff. And that definitely is the case in many of our systems at this time. Let's see. All right. I really appreciate how far we got to drop into these questions. We are now at a point where we will be taking an access break. We're going to take a break for our hardworking access team who is helping us make this event more accessible.
Before we
Shout out
do
to
that,
them.
I just wanted to respond here. Somebody had a question that I think is important, which was a question about Grace's question. What are the proposed de-escalation techniques you would have a library staff use with teens? Well, that's something to work out with your particular library community, because the only way, and I think this is an issue that's really hard for people to wrap their brains around when we're still stuck in the take something off the shelf and bring it in to actually fix the problem mode. And that is not something that is like that's something that's like a diffuse problem in our culture, I see. And for me, it's like, what are folks in your space comfortable doing? I wonder if there's any opportunity, for example, in a staff meeting to set aside 15 to 20 minutes, maybe in staff meeting, if that's even possible, to just have a conversation with your team members and everybody there about like kind of giving a culture audit about how things are going around conflicts that are emerging within the space. And asking people there, I mean, you probably have people on your team who are much more comfortable working with teenagers than they are working with adults, and other people who are much more comfortable working with small people than they are with grown people. Finding out who's in your space and who might be able to step in when is a super good assessment tool to like helping out when shit's going down. You know who to turn to or who you should reach out to in your particular community. If your library, for example, example, has a Friends of the Library group. How many of the people that are in the Friends of the Library could be potential people who maybe are also educators in your community? Perhaps they're the person to call to come in and do a small mini training for the whole entire staff about working well with teenagers and what their experience of that has been. And perhaps they're a person who'd be willing to be on a speed dial for should things go down, and they might come out, you know, after work or on a Saturday, and maybe you'd be willing to sit in a circle, a peace circle, a restorative circle with the teenager who caused the havoc, right? And if they want to come back to the space, that one of the things they agree to might just be that, to come and talk through what happened and why it happened, and not let that be necessarily held by the staff. If the staff want to be part of that circle, all the better. But maybe it's the community that holds that conflict, because the community is impacted, because it's a community space. So we want it to be safe for everyone. Like, there's just, we have to, in my mind, we have to stop, like, we have to get much freer with our thinking about who's at our disposal to potentially step in to support on stuff. And it cannot just be the paid people in a building. It has to be broader than that. That means a complete shift in how we think about our workplaces, our society, how we manage conflict. And I know that feels overwhelming, but I've seen so much done in local hyper contexts where folks have figured out how not to call the police. So it's clearly not magic, because it's done every single day. Because if it weren't, we wouldn't have any cops, because there'd be a call made every hour on the hour to resolve conflict. And that's not what's happening. So folks are actually figuring it out. I think that we should take solace in that, actually. It's a real opportunity. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I do sense sometimes when I'm in conversation, I'm not saying this is you at all, Grace, but I'm just saying, like, I sense a sense of anxiety, but also sometimes a sense of exasperation. It's like, well, you fucking come here and figure it out. These, you know what, like that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that's where you're coming from, but I've heard that 100 times, you know, like from people. It's like, you figure out how to do it. Well, yeah, I actually have figured out how to do that with young people who are very difficult to manage in terms of their behavior sometimes, you know, but we figured out how to move through it. So it's possible. It's possible. We're going to move on. Just next slide. Want to thank Megan and Bean. You'll hear from them again in a minute. And this, I just want to bring us back, because I think there's a lot of questions here about like skills and skill building. And I think it's so important for the conversation. And I want to go back to Grace's excellent comments and point, and just you know, a question about what other people have found helpful in their skill building around either intervening around conflicts, figuring out ways to do non-carceral interventions. We heard about creative interventions. I saw somebody put a link in the chat to a crisis, some sort of crisis facilitation or crisis workshop series. Oh yeah, here it is. Library, Tracy's library has been offering a training for staff based on the crisis prevention verbal intervention. I don't know, y'all, have other people gone through this? Because my understanding is that there are some people who feel like maybe, am I wrong that this is a training that has like mixed reviews? Or can somebody let me know? This is the training here. It's in the chat. If somebody can respond here.
MK, are you just asking if people have engaged in this training before and found it useful or
Have
problematic?
people engaged? Yeah. If people have engaged in that training, that Tracy shared, that's called crisisprevention.com. I don't know. There's so many trainings now that go around, and there's so many people who have so many views on them that it's hard to keep up. So I just was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about that particular training. Erin, you can pin me if you need to as well. So one of the So as folks are responding or not to that question, what we wanted to kind of take the experience of what being kind of the incident that happened in the Baltimore library, some thoughts around those questions, which we could have gone through, you know, individually and just kind of thought about together, worked through what we really have ideas about in terms of the support that might be needed by you in that kind of situation, who might be the other people that you would reach out to. This is all as an attempt to try to map out a game plan, often before these kinds of incidents happen, so that when the incidents happen, you have a place to turn to, having already thought through a lot of the responses that might, you know, need to be had. So a few years ago, I was reading a book by somebody named Kazu Haga. It's a book called Healing Resistance. It was published in 2020. And Kazu's a longtime peacemaker, a restorative justice practitioner, a kind of healing justice practitioner, and he in a long standing, very like excellent at what he does. And he is part of I think it's called the East Bay Peace Academy out in the Bay Area. But anyway, Kazu wrote this book, and one of the pieces that jumped out at me was his conversation around what are the 3 conditions that can help make conflict generative. So basically riffing off of the work of Mickey Cashton, who's a longtime nonviolent communication practitioner, Haga identifies these 3 conditions that help to make conflict generative. And those 3 conditions are skill, relationship, and structure. And he offers in the book kind of this Venn diagram that is supposed to help you gauge what is in place and what might be missing so that you can adjust accordingly. And Haga basically says in the book that at least 2 of these conditions need to be in place for example, for a difficult conversation to go well. If you're about to engage in a difficult conversation over a conflict in your workplace, in your home, in any space that you're in, but you have to have at least 2 of the conditions in place to like ensure that you could actually maybe hold that conversation. And so an example of that, he says basically, if we don't have the trusting relationships in our community, then we need skilled people. And we also need a really good structure to help manage conflicts. So remember, 2 conditions. If you don't have those 2 conditions, stuff's probably not going to go very well. So, but if you do have those 2 conditions, you can hold that together and try to manage your conflicts, hopefully in a good way. So I mentioned not having the relationships means that you need skilled people and a good structure. Let's say, for example, you don't have the actual skilled people or the skills yourself. In that case, we need structure and strong relationships in order to be able to navigate through conflict in our spaces. So at one point in the book, on page 82, he says, structures, policies, systems, and bureaucracies are often an attempt to compensate for a lack of trust, relationships, and skills. So when I read that, it like blew my mind because I always kind of intuitively understood this to be the case, but I hadn't had anybody lay it out so clearly for me. And I started talking to other people, and it turned out it really made a lot of sense. So we were like, well, the more we build our relationships then and develop our skills, then the less structures we're going to need. Because we have these other 2 things. We've got the relationships and we got the skills, and we're bringing that together. So that means we feel more at ease about not necessarily relying on these policies as like the tablets that are brought down by Moses, right? Like you can be like, hey, y'all, like let's work this out. And then you have the ability to be able to do that in a way that leaves you in a better place. So given that kind of way of thinking about it, myself, even Nagao and Shayna Agid, have been working together for several years on this transformative justice skill project, where we've been training people in cohorts around conflict mediation and verbal de-escalation through Interrupting Criminalization and Project NIA. And one of the things we ended up doing was adapting for our team this idea of relationship skills and structure, and using that as the basis for helping people to think through how they might intervene in their local community to create more of a kind of transformative justice infused, or at least values infused infrastructure to address harm and conflict in their particular communities. So I'm seeing here. Oh, yes, absolutely. I can do that. Thanks, Erin. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the document so you have it. But as I mentioned, we'll also have this in the Google Doc that we'll give you at the end of this. And then so you'll be able to have it as well. But you see on the screen just kind of a general sense of it. And I'm going to offer a suggestion of how perhaps you might use this in your community, your library community, your workplace, your space that you're in, right? So let's say that, let me see here. You can see here this three-legged stool, which is kind of like, you can use it as an assessment, all right? So what are the skills in your space that you already have and use? What are the skills that you all already have and use? And this, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking specifically around the de-escalation case study that we went through, right? The need for a way to be able to intervene. So we're using that example and that experience. What if you had spent some time thinking about what were the skills that already were in existence and in use within your particular workspace, community, place that you're at, your library? And then what support do you need to improve or gain capacity in those areas? So having your whole entire staff go through this kind of mini assessment and say, like, you know, the places I feel kind of weak or not so strong are here. And maybe you get together and a demand gets made around a professional development day just on building up those particular skills that were identified as lacking within your team, in your particular space. Maybe you already have people in-house who are excellent at those skills. Then you don't have to go out and pay a whole bunch of outside people a bunch of money to come in and do a training. You may already have people in-house who already know how to do that. And you just need time together to figure out how to like exchange those skill buildings opportunities with each other, right? Relationships. Who are the people with whom you're actually going to do the skill building? Also, what are the relationships that you have or are going to have to challenge yourself to build? This is a really important question, in my opinion, because oftentimes we're in a place where we don't actually even know what it is we don't know. We haven't assessed what it is that we actually want from the relationships that we are building. But like, what do you need to be thinking about? Who are the folks you're looking at and thinking, this is somebody I need to build a stronger relationship with because this person could really be helpful to me as I'm trying to build up my skills? What are the structures that are going to actually support you with the work where you are? Are there institutions in the community? Like, is there a local church, a synagogue, a mosque where there's a faith leader who's like super good at coming in and supporting people when really hard things are going on? Can you make more of an opportunity to connect with that person? Can they be somebody you call on should stuff go haywire in your community, in your space, in your, your work community? Like, who are those folks? What are those institutions? Do you know about the local domestic violence organization in your community? Like, really, do you really know about them? Have y'all like done a little meeting where you've gone over to their site and met with each other and talked about like what happens when somebody comes to your library and they're in a domestic violence situation? How could you, instead of sending them to anonymous 800 number. Rather, there's a person you call and it's like Tiffany, because Tiffany's the counselor over there. And you know that that's that person. And you can trustingly send the patron to that particular space to get what they need. Think of doing that though, with like all different kinds of things in your community that are non-carceral, right? People are like, oh, well, that's going to be so much work. Not more work than all the stuff you're handling right now, which is last minute crisis or running around at the last second trying to find what you need. Prevention, 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 pre-planning, pre-mapping, all that leads to saving time on the back end. You know, so just if you think about this, use this perhaps. I don't know if it might be useful if you're thinking about how it could be useful and applied in your particular location. But I know a lot of people that we work with have been using these along with the pod mapping that the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative kind of that when during the pandemic, pod maps became like all of a sudden popularized, even they were something that has been in the making for years before that. But, you know, these are things that could be helpful to us in crisis, but they're just also helpful to us in building up our relationships and strengthening them in general over time, practicing how to do that in a regular way and doing it in a non-stressful situation, doing it during taking 10 minutes at your next staff meeting and just your whole entire team doing the skills questions. And then the next staff meeting, taking 10 minutes and having the team go over the relationships and then discussing it with each other. And then thinking through the structures. And then thinking about how you might build the TJ infrastructure, a list of questions there to help guide you. Wondering if people can see some value in this in your space. Feel free to put that in the chat. I'm interested to hear if any of this is helpful, is resonating, something that you think you can accomplish and do in your space. Feel free to drop in the chat. Have I completely put everybody into like a comatose state? Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, these are just, again, small tools, small assessments, small ways of getting in conversation with your community of folks and kind of testing out where you're at, you know? Yeah. Sarah says, yes, I often feel like a challenge is not having or making the space to get many staff members on the same page and thinking about de-escalation. So I love the idea of chunking this conversation out at staff meeting. Yeah, like, because you all have a million things on your plate. You know, this isn't the only thing you have to handle and deal with on a daily basis. And as was mentioned before, there are structural impediments to the fact that like libraries are literally being defunded and staff don't have enough staff to do all this stuff. And it feels like another imposition and another amount of like heavy work that you have to do when you already have so much heavy work. And I really hear that. And you're also not social workers trained necessarily. So it feels like just another role that you have to take on when you already have all these other roles you have to meet. So I hear all that. I'm just trying to offer like ways to like creatively be able to have more conversations so that you can hold this stuff within your space while we fight for the broader stuff, which is an expansion of resources, unionized libraries, like all the things that are needed for this to really become a cultural shift that will actually make a difference for patrons and staff as well in library spaces. So thank you. I says, I'm thinking about how this would be feasible and the challenges of it, the particularities of how space matters so much for library contact. My library is basically a hallway and a study room across multiple floors and really prevents us from building connections to patrons. That's so real. That is so real. Thank you for that. We had a really awful safety de-escalation training a few weeks ago that was so, they recommended we should read The Gift of Fear. Kate. I'm sorry, that sucks. That sucks. Katie says, absolutely helpful. I work on a community college campus, and getting to know the rest of our campus is even, let me see here, is even a great first start. Our counseling, health, yes, exactly. Like, let's build the ecosystem of care that's needed so that our institutions aren't isolated islands in the midst of a huge sea. Like, we do need to know each other's names. It is helpful for us to know the, if there's a school that's like down the street, it shouldn't just be the head of the library, right? The administrator that knows the principal or knows the name of potentially the restorative justice coach over there or the counselor over there. Like, it should be also that our, staff in the organization writ large could get to know those people too. So that when stuff goes down, sometimes, those kids are in those spaces in those schools 8 hours a day. There are lots of people there who know them, but much better sometimes than we do in other spaces. So we just need to like creatively keep thinking about how to expand the circles. How do we widen our circles? Every day is not an attempt to shrink our circles, but rather to widen our circles constantly. More people, more relationships, stronger relationships, building self skills, building team skills, figuring out what you like to do, and so that you don't have to do it, so you can do that, and what you don't like to do, which somebody else probably in your organization loves doing, and make sure they do that. Like, how do we do this in a kind of way that feels sustainable for us is an important part of building safety within our communities, our spaces, our lives in general. Like, we don't all have to do everything. And I think sometimes it feels that way because like everything feels so precarious. But like, we don't actually all have to do everything. And if we take the time to do the assessing, that's even giving us more leeway not to have to do everything, So I want to move on, and then I'm going to throw over to Bean and to Megan to take us home. But one thing that we also made for this session was a resource, which I'm going to drop in the chat, which is very much like, and I want to say this again, because I want to make sure you hear me when I say it, which is that it is in process. It is absolutely in process. And what you see on the screen here is this, basically it's like a concentric circle chart that some of you may have seen from Critical Resistance. If you've ever seen their curriculum on abolition, PIC abolition, they have an excellent activity around the concentric circles of the prison industrial complex. And this project, which is called the Corrections Project, kind of created a more interactive version of it that I'm going to put a link in the chat, but it's also in the materials that we'll share with you. And we were trying to think about how to do this, but for libraries, how to do this about criminalization and libraries. And as per usual, I offered a big brain dump of materials, and I was like, help me out, figure out how to make this make any sense. I was really lucky to have my friend Sarah, I think, who might be on today, Sarah Cuck, who was able to, was my classmate at library school, and a comrade. We kind of worked together to think through what could this be, and Sarah really used a lot of her skills and her visual talents to help make this thing possible. So we created this kind of chart map thing to try to map out like the ways that criminalization and libraries intersect in a more specific way than the opening broad strokes of this. And you can see this is the beginning of these concentric circles. And I'm gonna I put in the chat the document that Max designed that was through this. Perhaps, like, again, you've seen the corrections project piece that tries to illustrate the various layers, manifestations, and impacts of the prison industrial complex. And what we're trying to kind of depict here is that it's kind of impossible to neatly divide things into like historical, contemporary, internal, external, because many of the categories are really entangled and enmeshed. And we're not aiming, I know for the info workers on here, we're not aiming for clean classification on here. We are clearly like, this is porous and things move. towards each other, but the primary goal is really to show people the various ways in which and in the myriad directions from which carcerality infiltrates and even undergirds libraries. So in the center, you have libraries. Then you have the inner circle where we try to map out around the history of libraries. Then you have a middle circle, which we're looking at the internal influences and their impact and how carcerality infuses, right? How carcerality infiltrates and even undergirds the internal influences. And then we have an outer circle of the external influences. And we also want to see and understand here how carcerality infiltrates and undergirds libraries through those mechanisms. And then we have kind of the surrounding area of the other part of the concentric circle, results of the inequalities that are holding all of this together. And then we have the kind of academic libraries, school libraries, public libraries, and prison libraries as sites of struggle and sites of contestation in this. And we don't have time today, as I mentioned, to like go through everything on the document that we just shared with you, but it is an offering to you as to if there are ideas that hit you, if you look at this and you're like, you know what would be really super interesting is this, or you know what you're missing is this. Like we, both Sarah, myself, Bean, and Megan, welcome anything that you have to share, any kind of pushbacks that you may notice here. I also want to mention that some of you might be educating folks who are in library schools or in information science programs, and maybe you're teaching courses around stuff like this. We value your input and your thoughts about maybe how you might adapt this and use this in your classrooms for students who are interested in wanting to think through these kinds of ways of how carcerality infiltrates and undergirds libraries and other forms of information, kind of carceral control of information. So give us your feedback about it. And also Sarah's here and I noticed that, yes, hello. So Sarah and I would love to see people's responses in the chat also as to like, this seems helpful or this sucks. We're not gonna take it personally. We both have very thick skins. So this is a piece that, again, an offering, a heuristic, an opportunity for people to build on if we think it's useful, and adapt according to your interests. All right, I'm going to throw over to Bean and to Megan, who are going to take us home. And then I think we might even have 10 minutes available for questions. So going to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, MK. That was wonderful. Bean and I are briefly going to talk about resisting criminalization and some resources. We've been focusing mostly on the criminalization of library patrons, but I did want to acknowledge the criminalization of library workers. It's come up a few times in the chat and in our discussion. And obviously, we're at a time right now where the criminalization of the library and information workers is really ramping up and honestly pretty scary. And I just wanted to say that for folks that are that may be experiencing this, that are here today, that you are not alone, first of all. We have some resources for connecting with others, and as well as some things like some anti-doxing tips and things like that, as well as all of the other lovely people that are here today to, you know, offer a community of support. I also want to emphasize the importance of solidarity and community in these times. We, you know, pretty clearly cannot rely on whether it's local government or federal government, even like the management at the libraries in which we work, or our professional organizations, I'm not going to name names, or the criminal justice system to protect us from criminalization in these times. And in many cases, they're the ones that are facilitating the criminalization. I also, this came up in the chat earlier, but I wanted to specifically mention, because of the current bombing campaign by Israel in Gaza, there is a group, or a rather loose organization called Librarians, Librarians and Archivists with Palestine. And I'm including, oh yes, thank you, Bean. So they're doing some really important work right now, and also are not just working with librarians and archivists in Palestine, but also working to provide resources for any library and information workers that may be experiencing backlash as a result of their support for Palestine. So again, these links are going to be in the resources document. Thank you, MK, for responding to targeted harassment, which again is also an increasing issue for academic librarians and faculty, as well as public library and school library workers. And on that note, I will pass it over to Bean to talk some more about groups and resources for library patrons.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, if we can move to the next slide, I think it should be, yeah. There are a lot of like awesome media, graphics, just different things that are coming out that I started to notice a lot more during the 2020 uprisings, and a lot of people being in quarantine and lockdown, and mobilizing in like social media spaces. One org that I noticed putting a lot of quality content is Cop Free Library. We see a tweet that they made. And for those who are having a hard time reading the graphic, the tweet itself says, "Who are we? We are NYC librarians opposed to police and libraries. Here is a comic listing some of our values. We are reposting our comic listing our values with alt text, since images without alt text are inaccessible to many people." And then they go on to list out those values, and I believe that might be on the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so they put out 4 values. The first one is that they advocate for no cops in libraries for any reason, which is a bold statement for those of us who work in libraries and know that, the first thing that many of us are trained to do if there is an altercation, if, universe forbid, there's an active shooter, this group is, saying that for any reason, no cops in libraries. Value 2, we stand in solidarity with teachers and education workers pushing for schools to divest from police. Value 3, we ask our institutions to reckon with the effects of policing in libraries and to confront white supremacy, past and present, in libraries. And value 4, we ask that library workers confront our internal biases and kill the cop in our heads. There is, I think, a link to that tweet. Let me see if I got it here. There we go. And I believe that there's also No Cops in Libraries zine. Let me know if any of those links are busted. But yeah, I mean, I think Cop Free Library and many other collective organizing efforts are out there to remove cops from libraries across the country, and just reclaiming that space of libraries, and to say that, we can coordinate together to make freer spaces, and to show, real and actual solidarity across different movements that we are a part of and that abolition struggles are a part of, such as like land back movements and anti-capitalist movements, anti-imperial movements. yeah, so just wanted to like lift that up and offer that as like one example of an organizing body that's doing that. Another one, which some of us are probably very active in or have heard of, is the Abolitionist Library Association. That is a group that exists not only via a listserv where there's a lot of really active conversation happening all the time, where people are, trying to workshop tough situations that they're struggling with in their systems, their library systems, asking for resources because they may have campaigns or organizing going on in the library systems that they work in, and are just asking like, hey, I'm looking for this particular type of article or this particular resource. Does anybody have it? And that's just like one space that I found really helpful. We do actually have a slide about them, about the Abolitionist Library Association, also known as ABLA. Thanks, Erin. Here's the mission and vision statement for ABLA. And if you are interested in joining this listserv, I have dropped a link in there for you to do that. You'll also find that a lot of the discussions that are happening on that listserv are about best policies and practices for engaging with difficult, challenging patron behaviors, and what we can do about that without involving or resorting to police. So just wanted to share that and put that out there. And then finally, one of the orgs that we've referenced a number of times is the Library Patrons Union, or LPU. Shout out to them, based in Minnesota. Also wanted to make sure that, I don't know if I shared it already, here is their trespass analysis when we were talking about examples of criminalization in libraries and their impact on the communities most impacted. This is one resource for that. It could be helpful to share with colleagues in your system when you're in that staff meeting and you're trying to talk about like, here's what we currently do, here's why it's a problem, what can we do instead? Having a resource that is really specific to libraries, that's written from a vantage point not only of library workers who are members of LPU, but also directly from library patrons. Just want to share that. And then finally, this is a larger document, but LPU also put out a report that has like an executive summary and everything. It's one of those kinds of reports. But it is about envisioning safety at the library system that where LPU is located, which is the Hennepin County Library. Yeah. Megan, can I pass it back to you to share and talk about the takeaway doc?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bean. That was great. And I definitely recommend signing up for the ABLA listserv if you haven't already. It's a really great way to get insight into what other folks are doing in terms of non-carceral interventions, as well as just, finding other like-minded people in the library world. Anyways, so we've been mentioning throughout this the resource doc that has all of these links that we've been sharing, as well as I've also included a little section of a couple of announcements and upcoming events, namely the next Building Your Abolitionist Toolbox event on November 30th. Thank you, Bean and MK. I also wanted to mention that Library Freedom Project is planning their Southeast Regional Hub Gathering in December. So if you are located in the Southeast and are interested in joining the gathering, there's contact information in this document. You can reach out to them. Yes, Library Freedom Project is great. And I also included some of their resources on anti-doxing in the resource document. We love them. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about the resource document. It's non-exhaustive, but you know, we tried to include everything that we talked about today, as well as a few little extras. I've been adding some things from the chat that people have shared as well. So thank you all for sharing your knowledge and resources with us. And
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things, we have 10 minutes, which we did really well, to have opportunity for any questions that have come up for people. You can take the slide down. Thank you so much, Erin. If there are any questions that anybody has, or anything you want to share that we can add to the document that we are pulling together for everybody to use and have, again, feel free to put into the chat. If this has been a helpful space tonight, that you think this is our first time pulling this together, so please put in the chat if you found it to be helpful. And if you did, certainly you can also hopefully access the recording soon, along with our slides and everything else, which will be on the Abolition Tools website. But I'm looking to see if there are any questions that people have into the chat, or provocations, or, you know, if there's something else that you envision that Libraries for the People, not Libraries for the People, Library Project, our website is librariesforthepeople.com. I keep getting that mixed up sometimes. But if there's something that you can imagine FTP being supportive and helpful to you about, if you're working in public libraries in particular, let us know. You can also email us. We've been having a bunch of gatherings that have been virtual. Megan and I partnered on pulling together kind of like a People's History of Public Libraries session for our launch. We had Emily Drabinsky come and do an excellent presentation, which is also on our website you can access. We've had a lot of other kind of gatherings in the last few weeks, where we're really trying to push the field a little bit more to the left. People keep thinking that it's already to the left, but no, really, we really mean the left of the left. But anyway, so we are open to other people's ideas and things that, that you have in mind that you think could be really helpful as well. And I really think that we are at the cusp of being able to do incredible things. One of the things that we're trying to do at FTP is get a bunch of leftists to run for the library boards, or to seek appointment on library boards. We need to be in places of governance, and we need to have some friggin' power, instead of running around stupid book ban stuff. And I mean, not stupid, excuse me. First of all, I'm not going to use the words good, ridiculous, book bans, like plugging our fingers in the dike and all the water is coming down that way. We need to be in power. So we're trying to get more people to take power roles around these systems that we care about, and maintain and expand the public goods, and, push for unionization across the board, and make sure that folks have good working conditions, and that the patrons have good conditions that they can be thriving in, and that we have public goods shared amongst all of us equally. So these aren't pie in the sky. This is the work. This is the horizon. So we're really grateful to you to spend time with us today. So has anybody said anything in the chat that was a question?
I just wanted to highlight a couple things in the chat. Oh, and also say, first of all, I would absolutely love at some point to do like a criminalization 201 for information workers that focuses more on like surveillance technologies, and also a little bit what Grace brought up, asking about, since library access is a First Amendment right, and are there any groups that you're aware of developing civil rights-based tools and initiatives to combat the practice of permanently banning or trespassing patrons? I think that would be something really interesting to talk about. And it makes me think of my colleague Jeremy, who I've worked with on a lot of projects, who is also a lawyer and is very interested in exactly that topic. So I can reach out to him. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. sorry. Somebody in the chat asked if the chat itself would be shared too, and
No,
I
we're
have
not,
no idea.
we're not sharing the chat. We're just sharing the resources and links in that document. Yeah.
Got it. Got it.
Mm.
Great. Thanks for
I saw
grabbing that,
somebody.
Dean.
I saw somebody else said that they'd be interested in like a workshop or a webinar that focused on something we touched on a little bit, which was the criminalization of library workers. I could envision that being part of like a 201 as well.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and then
then
I'm just
oh, go ahead.
just gonna say that I'm seeing a lot of appreciations for this space and also for folks on the Access team, interpreters and live captioners. Thank you.
Access team is the best. I also wanted to highlight I's comment about perhaps a future session devoted to library workers discussing our organizing power, both folks who are in unions and those who maybe need to be unionizing. And I think that would be a really excellent like kind of separate session on organized labor and criminalization in libraries. Yeah, that would be really, really great. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything else that they saw in the chat that they want to highlight. Oh, Kevin was asking if there are resources for power mapping. I believe that some of the links that we're including have some power mapping resources. There's also a previous Building Your Abolitionist Toolkit or Toolbox session on power mapping that is really helpful.
I'll include something also. Just are you thinking, Kevin, are you thinking like power mapping specific to the library, or is power mapping in general? Because there's more power mapping and organizing in general, not specific to libraries. What were you specifically interested in?
Ooh, in general, Kevin said.
General. Okay, great. We'll put something in that document.
Seeing another vote for sessions about unionizing and how to shift union priorities for safety away from police. And I really appreciate that, because I do think that this is one of the places where leftist abolitionist library workers can be really impactful inside of like libraries, how they run and what their operations are. Because like I shared in my library, I think that our fight for addressing staff safety can really go one of these two ways. And if we really organize and build our power so that we don't make that a missed opportunity in favor of the structures and the skills that we need to actually like ethically respond to safety concerns, I think that's one major site. Just wanted to say that. I just wanted to encourage folks too that if you already submitted your question earlier in the chat, Zoom chats are tough to keep up with. So feel free to just share again. We want to hear from you, and we're sorry if we missed anyone earlier.
All right, I think we're good, and we'll wrap up. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank my excellent co-facilitators, Megan and Bean, and comrades in the struggle. Thanks to our access team, everybody, our interpreters, our live captioner. Thank you, Aaron, for hooking us up. Thank you to all of you for being here. We are so grateful you took the time in a busy, hard period to be here, but we hope that this was actually a space that allowed you to feel a little bit held as we go through really hard times. And again, during hard times, it's kind of good to be together, even if we're just kind of talking about hard stuff. It still can be a balm, even if we're doing that, and especially if we're doing that because we're not alone, and we could see that other people care as well. So thank you all, and if you are interested, come to our next Building Your Abolitionist Toolbox series, co-hosted by Project NIA and Interrupting Criminalization. Connect with us at For the People, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.